On the morning of March 15th, 1851, in Henrico County, Virginia, a 29-year-old enslaved seamstress named Mary used nothing but thread, fabric, and her extraordinary intelligence to begin a plan that would end 8 powerful men's lives in just 4 months. 8 plantation owners dead, not from weapons, not from fire, not from direct confrontation, but from their own secrets, their own shame, and their own desperate need to protect their reputations in elite Southern society. Mary didn't need violence. She only needed to understand one simple truth. Wealthy white men feared scandal more than they feared death itself. Have you ever wondered what it takes to bring down the untouchable? What weapons does the powerless person have when the law, the system, and society itself stands against them? You're about to discover a story that history tried to erase. A story of intelligence triumphing over brutality. A story that proves the human mind, when pushed to its limits, becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. But before you understand how Mary orchestrated this masterpiece of psychological warfare, you need to understand the world she lived in. A world where people were bought and sold like livestock, where mothers could be separated from their children at an auction, where intelligence had to hide behind servitude to survive, where one woman's tragedy became the catalyst for perfect, calculated justice. Welcome to Henrico County, Virginia, in 1851. Just 10 years before, the Civil War would tear the nation apart. This is the story they don't teach in textbooks. This is the America that built its wealth on stolen bodies and broken families. This is Mary's story. Henrico County sat just outside Richmond, Virginia's capital, in the heart of tobacco country. By 1851, tobacco had made this region incredibly wealthy. The families who controlled the land lived like aristocrats, building grand estates with white columns and manicured gardens. They attended balls, hosted elaborate parties, and prided themselves on their refinement, their culture, their civilization. Behind this elegant facade stood a brutal reality. The wealth, the parties, the refined lifestyle, all of it rested on the backs of human beings held in bondage. Henrico County's population in 1851 was roughly 60% enslaved. Thousands of people who worked from dawn until darkness, who built the mansions they could never enter as guests, who raised the white children who would grow up to own them. The social structure among Virginia's planter elite was rigid and complex. Reputation meant everything. Family lineage mattered. Social standing could be destroyed by scandal. These wealthy families competed constantly, not just for land and profit, but for social supremacy. Who attended whose parties? Who married into which families? Who sat in which pew at church? These questions consumed them, and here's what Mary understood better than anyone. These people would do absolutely anything to protect their reputations, anything to avoid scandal, anything to maintain their position in society. This knowledge became her weapon. Mary had been born in 1822 on Riverside Plantation, owned by the Thornton family. Her mother, Ruth, worked in the tobacco fields. Her father had been sold away before Mary turned 3. She carried only one memory of him: strong hands lifting her up, a deep voice singing a song she couldn't quite remember. Then he was gone, sold to a trader heading to the deep South. Ruth never spoke of him after that. The pain was too deep, the loss too permanent. Young Mary learned to sew at age 7. The Thornton family's elderly seamstress, a woman named Aunt Bess, recognized something in the serious, observant child. Bess had no daughters of her own and began teaching Mary the skills that would define her life. How to make tiny, invisible stitches. How to work with delicate fabrics. How to create garments that transformed ordinary cloth into elegant fashion. But Bess taught Mary something more valuable than sewing techniques. She taught her to listen, to observe, to understand the white family's dynamics, by watching how they interacted, how they treated their clothes, what they said when they thought no servants were listening. "You see more than they know, child," Bess had whispered during late-night sewing sessions. "You hear things. You learn things. That's power, even if it doesn't feel like it. You remember what I'm telling you. Knowledge is the only thing they can't take from us." By age 16, Mary had become Riverside Plantation's primary seamstress. She created dresses for the Thornton daughters, suits for the sons, elaborate garments for Mrs. Thornton's endless social engagements. Her work was exquisite, her reputation growing among Henrico County's elite families. The wealthy ladies began requesting Mary specifically. They would bring fabric from Richmond shops, show her designs from French fashion magazines, and commission her to create copies. Mary's small sewing room in the plantation's outbuilding became a revolving door of Virginia's most prestigious women, and Mary, sitting quietly with her needle and thread, heard everything. She heard about affairs, about financial troubles, about family secrets that would ruin reputations if revealed. She heard confessions, gossip, plans, fears. The wealthy women talked freely around her, forgetting or not caring that she had ears, a mind, a memory. To them, she was just property. A skilled tool, certainly, but not a full human being capable of understanding or remembering their conversations. They couldn't have been more wrong. Mary married Samuel in 1844 when she was 22. Samuel worked as a blacksmith on a neighboring plantation owned by the Harrison family. Their marriage followed the informal pattern of enslaved unions not recognized by law but sacred to those involved. Master Thornton gave permission, seeing stable relationships as beneficial. Married people ran away, less. They produced children who would become valuable property. Mary and Samuel built what happiness they could in the margins allowed to them. They saw each other on Sundays, their one partial day of rest. They talked about dreams of freedom, about saving enough money to buy their way out of bondage, knowing it was nearly impossible but needing to hope for something. In 1847, Mary gave birth to a daughter they named Grace. Beautiful, perfect Grace with her father's eyes and her mother's serious expression. Mary held her newborn and felt joy and terror in equal measure. Joy because this child was love made flesh. Terror because Grace was born into slavery, property before she drew her first breath, owned by Master Thornton, who could sell her at any moment. But Mary allowed herself to hope. She was valuable to the Thornton family. Her sewing brought them prestige and additional income. Surely they wouldn't destroy her family. Surely they would let her keep her child. For 4 years, life continued. Mary sewed. Samuel worked. Grace grew from infant to walking, talking child who loved to sing and dance, who made her parents laugh despite the hardship of their circumstances. Then came January 1851. Master Thornton's eldest son, Robert, had accumulated enormous debts from gambling and bad investments. The family faced financial pressure. They needed cash quickly to avoid public embarrassment and potential loss of property. On January 22, 1851, Mary returned to her cabin after a day of sewing to find Samuel waiting with a stricken expression. Grace was gone, sold to a trader that very afternoon, 4 years old, taken from her mother without warning, heading south on a wagon already miles away. Mary collapsed. The sound that came from her wasn't quite human. It was the noise of a soul being torn in half. Samuel held her while she screamed, while she tried to run after the wagon, while she begged God for mercy that didn't come. Master Thornton heard the commotion and came to the cabin. "Quiet down, Mary. You're frightening the other property. The child brought a good price. You should be proud she had value." Mary looked up at him. In that moment, something fundamental changed. The mask she'd worn her entire life, the servile, obedient seamstress, cracked completely. Behind it stood someone who had learned from Aunt Bess to observe, to listen, to remember, and Mary remembered everything. Every secret she'd heard in that sewing room. Every scandal whispered by wealthy ladies who forgot she was there. Every piece of information that could destroy these people who had just destroyed her. "You'll make more children," Thornton said dismissively. "Get back to work tomorrow. Mrs. Harrison needs her dress completed by the weekend." That night, Mary didn't sleep. She sat in her cabin while Samuel tried to comfort her, and her mind worked with cold precision. She thought about the 8 men most responsible for her daughter's sale. Master Thornton, who made the decision. Robert Thornton, whose debts created the need. The slave trader, James Whitfield, who bought Grace. The 4 neighboring plantation owners who had purchased enslaved people from Thornton in the past and would likely buy from him again. And Reverend Thomas McKinley, who preached every Sunday about Christian duty while profiting from the trade in human beings. 8 men, all of them pillars of Henrico County society, all of them protected by law, by wealth, by social position, all of them completely vulnerable in ways they didn't understand, because Mary knew their secrets. And she knew exactly how to use them. If you're feeling rage right now, you should. This happened. Not to Mary specifically, perhaps, but to thousands of women just like her. Mothers who had their children torn away. Families destroyed by financial transactions. People treated as property, as things to be bought and sold. This is American history. The history textbooks minimize the daily horror, the casual cruelty, the systematic destruction of human families for profit. Mary's story represents those who found ways to fight back when the law offered no protection. Her story needs to be told. Over the next week, as Henrico County's social calendar continued its usual patterns, Mary moved through her duties in a haze. She sewed. She maintained her work quality. She spoke when spoken to. She appeared to be accepting God's will as a good Christian servant should. But every night, alone in her cabin, her mind worked. She reviewed everything she knew about the 8 men on her list. She thought about their weaknesses, their fears, their secrets. She thought about how elite Southern society functioned, how reputations could be destroyed, how scandal worked like disease, spreading from person to person until it consumed everyone it touched. And slowly, piece by piece, a plan emerged. It was dangerous. One mistake meant death, but it was also elegant, perfect. It would destroy them all without her ever raising a hand in violence. They would destroy themselves and each other, and she would simply watch. The key was understanding what Southern gentlemen feared most: exposure. These men built their entire lives on image, on respectability, on maintaining their position in society. Reveal the wrong secret, and a man's social standing would collapse. His family would be shunned. His business would fail. His entire world would crumble. Mary's plan required 3 phases. First, plant seeds of suspicion. Create doubt among the men, making them question each other's loyalty. Second, introduce evidence of scandal. Carefully fabricated proof that would seem completely authentic. Third, watch as paranoia and desperation made them take increasingly reckless actions that would lead to their own destruction. She began in early February, 2 weeks after Grace's sale. She started with Mrs. Harrison, wife of one of the plantation owners on her list. Mrs. Harrison came for a dress fitting, bringing her daughter Elizabeth, who was engaged to marry Robert Thornton in June. While pinning the hem of Mrs. Harrison's gown, Mary spoke carefully. "Mrs. Harrison, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but I feel I must tell you something. Last week, when I was fitting Miss Elizabeth's wedding dress, I heard Master Robert talking to a gentleman outside the sewing room. They were discussing finances, and Master Robert mentioned he owed money to someone named, I think it was Clara. He said he needed to settle accounts with her before the wedding. Mrs. Harrison's face went pale. "Clara, are you certain that was the name?" "Yes, ma'am. I remember because it's such a pretty name. Like I said, I hope I'm not speaking out of place." "No, no. You did right to tell me." Mary returned to her sewing, hiding her satisfaction. She knew exactly what Mrs. Harrison was thinking. Clara Whitfield was the wife of slave trader James Whitfield. But Clara was also known throughout Henrico County as a woman of questionable morals. Rumors circulated about her entertaining male visitors when her husband traveled. Mary had just planted the suggestion that Robert Thornton owed Clara money. Mrs. Harrison would interpret this in the worst possible way, that Robert had been visiting Clara for immoral purposes and needed to pay her off before his wedding to Elizabeth. The seed was planted. Now it needed time to grow. 3 days later, Mrs. Harrison canceled Elizabeth's engagement to Robert Thornton. The news shocked Henrico County society. The wedding had been planned for months. What could have caused such a sudden change? Rumors spread. Some said Elizabeth had changed her mind. Others whispered about Robert's gambling debts. A few mentioned Clara Whitfield's name in hushed, scandalous tones. Robert Thornton was humiliated, publicly jilted, his reputation damaged. He confronted James Whitfield, demanding to know what lies the trader's wife had been spreading. The confrontation became heated. Threats were exchanged. Perfect, Mary thought, watching from the sewing room window as Robert stormed away from the Whitfield property. Let them turn on each other. But this was only the beginning. Mary had 7 more men to destroy, and she had barely started. Her next target was Reverend McKinley, the minister who preached about Christian mercy while participating in the slave trade, who baptized enslaved children before their owners sold them south, who counseled white families about morality while ignoring the immorality of the system that enriched him. McKinley had a secret Mary had learned 2 years earlier. She'd been sewing a coat for him when he left his Bible on her work table. Inside the Bible, tucked between pages, she'd found letters. Love letters from a woman named Margaret, addressed to McKinley, describing their relationship in explicit terms. Margaret wasn't McKinley's wife. She was married to another man, a planter named Douglas from a neighboring county. The affair had apparently continued for years, hidden from both their spouses, protected by McKinley's reputation as a man of God. Mary had carefully noted where McKinley kept those letters, in his Bible, always with him. What if someone discovered them? What if they were revealed publicly? McKinley's career would be finished, his reputation destroyed, his position in society collapsed. Mary couldn't steal the letters herself. That would be too obvious. But she could arrange for them to be discovered in a way that seemed accidental and inevitable. She approached the task carefully. She knew McKinley's habits from years of observation. Every Sunday after services, he would visit various plantation families, offering spiritual counsel, sharing meals, building relationships that cemented his position in the community. On the first Sunday of March, McKinley visited Riverside Plantation. He joined the Thornton family for dinner, then retired to the library to discuss spiritual matters with Master Thornton. He left his Bible, as usual, on the side table. Mary had been instructed to serve tea during the meeting. When she entered with the tea service, she deliberately stumbled, spilling hot tea across the side table. The Bible got soaked. "Oh, Reverend, I'm so sorry," Mary exclaimed, grabbing cloth napkins to blot the damage. "Let me dry these pages before they're ruined." She opened the Bible, pressing napkins between the pages, making a show of trying to save the book. In the process, several letters fell out onto the floor. Master Thornton picked them up automatically, glancing at them before handing them back to McKinley. But Mary saw his expression change as he read the first few lines. Saw recognition, saw shock, saw disgust. McKinley grabbed the letters, his face flushed, stammering excuses about counseling correspondence from troubled parishioners. But the damage was done. Thornton had seen enough to understand what those letters were. And Thornton, despite his many flaws, considered himself a moral man. An affair between a minister and a married woman violated everything he claimed to believe about proper society. Within days, whispers began circulating. Reverend McKinley and Margaret Douglas. Questions were raised. Both denied everything, but the rumors persisted. Margaret's husband confronted McKinley. The confrontation became public, loud, impossible to ignore. The church board called a meeting. They couldn't ignore the scandal. They couldn't keep a minister whose reputation was destroyed. On March 18th, 1851, Reverend Thomas McKinley was removed from his position, disgraced, his life's work ruined, his social standing obliterated. 3 days later, McKinley went into his barn, closed the door, and hanged himself, 1 down, 7 to go. The death of Reverend McKinley sent shockwaves through Henrico County's elite society. Suicide was considered a mortal sin, a final act of desperation that confirmed, in many minds, his guilt. The whispers grew louder. The scandal spread, and Mary, sitting quietly in her sewing room, listened to every word. But she felt no satisfaction yet. McKinley was one man. 7 remained. And among those 7 was the slave trader James Whitfield, the man who had literally put his hands on her daughter and carried Grace away. For him, Mary had planned something special, something that would make him suffer before he died. The social fabric of Henrico County was already fraying. The broken engagement between Robert Thornton and Elizabeth Harrison had created a rift between 2 powerful families. McKinley's disgrace had shaken the community's faith in their moral leaders. Paranoia was beginning to spread. People were questioning what other secrets might be hiding beneath the surface of their refined society. Mary understood that paranoia was her most powerful weapon. She didn't need to destroy these men directly. She needed to make them destroy each other. And nothing creates destructive paranoia faster than the fear of exposure. Her next move targeted James Whitfield, the slave trader. Whitfield operated one of the largest trading operations in central Virginia. He bought enslaved people from plantations facing financial difficulty and sold them to the expanding cotton plantations in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. It was brutal, profitable business that required a certain reputation. Whitfield needed to be seen as honest, as someone who paid fair prices and conducted business properly. Mary knew something about Whitfield's operation that few others knew. She had learned it from overhearing conversations between wealthy ladies whose husbands did business with him. Whitfield was cheating his clients. When he bought enslaved people, he would provide documentation showing one price, but he would actually sell them for significantly more, pocketing the difference. The plantation owners he bought from never knew because they never followed up on the sales. They took their money and moved on. This fraud, if revealed, would destroy Whitfield's business. No planter would work with a trader they couldn't trust. His entire operation would collapse. But Mary needed more than business failure for Whitfield. She needed his complete destruction, and she knew exactly how to achieve it. Whitfield kept detailed records in his office, ledgers showing purchases and sales, documentation of every transaction. Mary had never seen these records herself, but she knew they existed. And she knew where his office was located, in a building on the edge of Richmond, where he conducted his business. She couldn't access those records directly, but she knew someone who could. Samuel, her husband. Samuel worked as a blacksmith and was occasionally hired by Whitfield to do repairs on the holding pens where enslaved people were kept before being sold south. Mary approached Samuel carefully one evening in late March. They sat in their cabin, the space feeling emptier than ever without Grace's presence. "Samuel, I need your help with something," Mary said quietly. "Something dangerous. Something that could get us both killed if we're caught." Samuel looked at her, seeing something in her face he'd never seen before. A cold determination that was frightening in its intensity. "This is about Grace, isn't it?" he said. "This is about all of them. Everyone who took her. Everyone who participated. everyone who stood by and let it happen. "Mary, what are you planning?" "Justice, the only kind we'll ever get." She explained what she needed: for Samuel to gain access to Whitfield's office during one of his repair jobs, to find the ledgers, to make copies of specific pages showing the price discrepancies, to do it without being seen or caught. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "For Grace. For you. I'll do it." 2 weeks later, Samuel reported back. He had gained access to the office during a repair job. He had found the ledgers. And he had done something even better than making copies. He had taken 3 pages directly from the ledger, pages from recent months showing clear evidence of Whitfield's fraud. "How will you use these?" Samuel asked, handing Mary the folded pages. "I'm going to give them to the one person who will make sure everyone sees them," Mary said. "Mrs. Eleanor Thornton." Master Thornton's wife was known throughout Henrico County as a formidable woman. She controlled social access to the elite circles. She decided who was invited to which events. She maintained the rigid social hierarchy through force of personality and strategic gossip. She was also deeply religious, absolutely convinced of her own moral superiority, and utterly ruthless when she felt betrayed or deceived. Mary had sewn countless garments for Mrs. Thornton over the years. She knew the woman's patterns, her habits, her psychology, and she knew that Mrs. Thornton despised being deceived, despised feeling foolish, despised the idea that someone might have taken advantage of her family. The Thorntons had sold several enslaved people to Whitfield over the past 2 years, including Grace. If Mrs. Thornton discovered that Whitfield had been cheating them, paying less than market value while claiming honest dealing, she would be enraged. Mary planned the revelation carefully. She knew Mrs. Thornton kept personal correspondence in a decorative box in her dressing room. Mary, as the seamstress who frequently worked in that space, had access to it. On April 3rd, while fitting Mrs. Thornton for a new day dress, Mary asked permission to use the dressing room to organize her sewing supplies. Mrs. Thornton agreed absently, focused on her reflection in the mirror. Mary slipped the stolen ledger pages into Mrs. Thornton's correspondence box, tucked between other papers where they would be found but would appear to have been there for some time. Then she returned to her sewing. 2 days later, the explosion came. Mrs. Thornton discovered the ledger pages. She immediately recognized what they were and what they meant. Whitfield had been defrauding her family. He had stolen from them while pretending to be an honest businessman. She showed the pages to her husband. Master Thornton's rage was immediate and volcanic. He gathered 3 other plantation owners whom Whitfield had done business with, showed them the evidence, and together they confronted the slave trader. Whitfield denied everything. He claimed the ledger pages were forgeries. He accused the planters of trying to destroy his business out of jealousy or spite. The confrontation became heated, then violent. On April 8, 1851, Master Thornton and 2 other plantation owners went to Whitfield's holding facility. They intended to search his office for more evidence. Whitfield, believing they were there to physically attack him, fired a shotgun at them as they approached. Master Thornton was killed instantly. One of the other planters, a man named William Stevens, was severely wounded. He died 2 days later from infection in his wounds. Whitfield was arrested immediately. The evidence of his fraud was overwhelming once the authorities searched his office and found the ledgers with missing pages. But the murder charges were more serious. He had killed 2 prominent white men. In Virginia in 1851, that meant only one thing: execution. James Whitfield was hanged on May 2, 1851, in Richmond, a public execution attended by hundreds. He died screaming his innocence, claiming he'd been framed, that someone had orchestrated everything to destroy him. No one believed him. How could they? He was a proven fraud and a murderer. His ravings were clearly the desperate lies of a guilty man facing justice. Mary stood in the crowd that day having convinced Mrs. Thornton that she needed to attend to sell some of the fine fabric goods in Richmond. She watched Whitfield hang, watched him struggle at the end of the rope, watched him die. 3 down, 5 to go. And Master Thornton's death was an unexpected bonus. The man who had sold her daughter was gone, but Mary felt no joy. Only a cold satisfaction, a sense that the scales were beginning to balance, even if they could never truly be even. The deaths of Thornton, Stevens, and Whitfield created chaos in Henrico County. 3 prominent men dead within weeks. The community was reeling. Some spoke of a curse. Others blamed the moral decay of society. The newspapers in Richmond covered the scandals extensively. And in the midst of this chaos, Mary continued working, continued sewing, continued listening, continued planning the destruction of the 4 men who remained on her list. Robert Thornton, now head of his family following his father's death, was spiraling. The broken engagement had humiliated him. His father's murder had traumatized him. His gambling debts continued to mount. He was drinking heavily, making increasingly erratic decisions, alienating the few allies he had left. Mary decided to accelerate his collapse. She knew Robert kept a journal where he recorded his debts, his gambling losses, his financial schemes. The journal was hidden in his room, tucked under a loose floorboard. Mary knew this because she'd been in that room countless times to deliver mended clothing. She also knew that Robert had been involved in illegal gambling operations, games that went beyond the socially acceptable card playing among gentlemen. He'd been participating in bare-knuckle fighting matches, betting enormous sums on the outcomes, often losing. These gambling dens were illegal. If the authorities discovered Robert's involvement, he could face criminal charges. More importantly, his social reputation would be completely destroyed. The Thornton family, already reeling from scandal and death, would be finished as a force in Henrico County society. Mary needed to get that journal into the right hands, and she knew exactly whose hands those should be. Sheriff Edward Harrison, father of Elizabeth, the young woman who had broken her engagement to Robert. Harrison despised Robert Thornton for the perceived insult to his daughter. He would be delighted to find evidence that could destroy the young man's reputation and potentially put him in prison. But how to get the journal to Harrison without revealing her own involvement? Mary solved this problem with elegant simplicity. She waited until Robert was away from the plantation on one of his gambling trips. Then she retrieved the journal from his room. She wrapped it in plain brown paper and left it on the sheriff's doorstep late at night, with a simple note written in deliberately crude handwriting. Robert Thornton's secrets. He deserves justice for what he's done. 3 days later, Sheriff Harrison raided one of the gambling dens Robert frequented. He arrested a dozen men, including Robert Thornton. The scandal was immediate and massive. Illegal gambling, association with criminals. The journal provided evidence of Robert's participation and his enormous debts. Robert was released on bail, but his reputation was destroyed. The Thornton family's social position, already weakened, collapsed completely. They were shunned, invitations stopped coming, business associates distanced themselves. On May 15th, Robert Thornton, facing financial ruin and social disgrace, took his father's pistol and ended his own life. A note found beside his body blamed everyone but himself for his downfall. He claimed he'd been persecuted, framed, destroyed by jealous rivals. 4 down, 4 to go. The remaining men on Mary's list were becoming increasingly paranoid. William Douglas, the husband of Margaret, who had been having an affair with Reverend McKinley, had become a recluse. The scandal had destroyed his marriage and his reputation. His wife had left him, returning to her family in North Carolina. He rarely left his plantation, drinking heavily, his mental state deteriorating. Mary decided to let Douglas destroy himself. She didn't need to intervene further. His own guilt and shame and rage were doing the work for her. On June 1st, Douglas's body was found in his study. He had consumed an entire bottle of laudanum, deliberately overdosing. Whether it was suicide or an accidental consequence of his drinking was unclear. Either way, he was dead. 5 down, 3 to go. The 3 remaining men, Benjamin Carter, Thomas Murphy, and Henry Blackwood, were all plantation owners who had bought enslaved people from Thornton in the past. They weren't directly involved in Grace's sale, but they had participated in the system. They had profited from human suffering, and Mary had heard enough of their conversations, enough of their wives' gossip, to know they all had secrets worth exploiting. Carter was having an affair with his brother's wife. Murphy had embezzled funds from a business partnership. Blackwood had been involved in a scheme to defraud the county government. Mary began working on all 3 simultaneously. She planted evidence of Carter's affair where his brother would find it. She arranged for Murphy's business partner to discover the financial discrepancies. She sent anonymous letters to county officials detailing Blackwood's fraud. The revelations came in rapid succession throughout June. Carter and his brother had a violent confrontation that ended with both men injured and their family torn apart. Murphy's business partner sued him, leading to a very public trial that exposed his theft. Blackwood was arrested and charged with corruption. But Mary wanted more than social disgrace and legal consequences. She wanted these men to understand what they had participated in. She wanted them to face the reality of what they had done. On June 20th, Mary did something she had never done before. She broke her silence. She approached Benjamin Carter, who was recovering from his confrontation with his brother. He was alone in his study, drinking, brooding over his ruined life. Mary entered without knocking. Carter looked up, surprised. "What do you want?" he demanded. "I want you to know why this is happening to you," Mary said, her voice steady and cold. "What are you talking about? Get out of here." "You bought an 8-year-old girl from Master Thornton 3 years ago. Her name was Lily. She was sold away from her mother. Do you remember her?" Carter's face went pale. "How dare you speak to me this way? I'll have you whipped." "By whom? Your family is destroyed. Your reputation is gone. You have no power left. But I want you to know, Lily's mother watched her daughter sold away, just like I watched my daughter taken, just like dozens of women on your plantation have watched their children sold. And you never cared. You never thought about it. You never considered that. We are human beings who feel pain, who love our children, who suffer when they're torn away. You're just property. You don't—" "I orchestrated all of this," Mary said quietly. "McKinley, Whitfield, the Thorntons, all of it. I destroyed them. And I destroyed you. Not through violence, through your own actions, through your own secrets, through your own weaknesses. I am just property, Mr. Carter. But I was smart enough to bring down all of you." She turned and walked out, leaving Carter staring after her in shock and growing horror. 3 days later, Benjamin Carter fled Henrico County. He abandoned his plantation, his remaining family, everything. He was never seen in Virginia again. Rumors suggested he went west, trying to start over where no one knew his name or his shame. 6 down, 2 to go. Thomas Murphy's trial concluded on July 2nd. He was found guilty of embezzlement and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His property was seized to pay back the money he'd stolen. His family was left destitute. In prison, Murphy's health deteriorated rapidly. The conditions were harsh, and he had lived a soft life of privilege. He contracted typhoid fever and died on August 10, 1851, less than 6 weeks after his conviction. 7 down, 1 to go. Henry Blackwood was the last man on Mary's list. His trial for defrauding the county was scheduled for August, but Blackwood was fighting back. He had hired expensive lawyers. He was calling in favors from political allies. He was determined to escape consequences. Mary watched his efforts with cold calculation. She had saved the most damaging information for last. She knew something about Blackwood that would destroy him completely, something even his expensive lawyers couldn't defend against. Blackwood had been involved in the illegal importation of enslaved people from Africa. The international trade in enslaved people had been illegal since 1808, but it continued in secret. Blackwood had participated in one such operation 5 years earlier, making an enormous profit from people smuggled directly from West Africa. Mary had learned this from overhearing a conversation between Blackwood's wife and another woman, a moment of drunken confession about her husband's risky but profitable venture from years past. If this information became public, Blackwood wouldn't just face local fraud charges. He would face federal prosecution for participating in illegal international trade. The penalties were severe, including potential execution. Mary gathered every piece of information she could find about Blackwood's involvement. She questioned other enslaved people who might have heard rumors. She carefully reconstructed the timeline. And then she wrote a detailed, anonymous letter to federal authorities in Washington. The letter laid out the evidence, provided dates and names, explained exactly what Blackwood had done. She mailed it through a contact in Richmond, ensuring it couldn't be traced back to her. 6 weeks later, federal marshals arrived in Henrico County. They arrested Henry Blackwood on charges of participating in illegal international trade in human beings. The evidence was overwhelming. Blackwood's defense collapsed. His expensive lawyers abandoned him. On October 15, 1851, exactly 8 months after Grace had been sold away, Henry Blackwood was convicted in federal court and sentenced to hang. 8 men, all dead or destroyed, all brought down by their own actions, their own secrets, their own weaknesses. Mary had orchestrated it all, and no one suspected her. How could they? She was just property, just a seamstress, just a simple, uneducated woman who knew nothing beyond needle and thread. The execution of Henry Blackwood marked the end of Mary's campaign of justice. 8 months, 8 men, all of them dead or destroyed, all of them brought down by a woman they had considered beneath notice, beneath consideration, beneath humanity itself. But justice, even perfect justice, came with a cost, and Mary was about to discover just how heavy that cost could be. In the aftermath of so much scandal and death, Henrico County's elite society was in chaos. Multiple prominent families had been destroyed. Social hierarchies had collapsed. Trust had evaporated. People looked at their neighbors with suspicion, wondering what secrets might be hiding, what scandals might erupt next. Some called it divine judgment. Others blamed moral decay. A few whispered about curses and supernatural forces. But no one, absolutely no one, suspected that a single enslaved woman had orchestrated the entire cascade of destruction. Mary had been careful. She'd never acted directly. She'd never left evidence that could be traced to her. Every revelation, every exposure, every piece of damaging information had appeared to come from natural sources, from accidents, from the inevitable consequences of the men's own actions. She had used their own weapons against them, their secrets, their shame, their desperate need to maintain reputation and social standing. She had understood that in elite Southern society, scandal was deadlier than any physical weapon. Exposure meant death, social death at minimum, actual death in several cases, and she had been patient. Each move had been calculated, timed perfectly to create maximum impact. Each revelation had built on the previous ones, creating momentum, creating paranoia, creating an atmosphere where people expected scandal and thus were more likely to believe it when it appeared. It was, in its way, a masterpiece, a demonstration of intelligence, planning, and psychological understanding that would have been praised as genius if accomplished by someone society recognized as fully human. But because it came from an enslaved woman, it remained invisible, unrecognized, attributed to coincidence and divine intervention. Mary returned to her sewing room in November 1851. The Thornton family was gone, scattered or dead. Riverside Plantation had been sold to pay debts. The new owner, a merchant from Richmond named Peters, who knew nothing about plantation management, had kept Mary on because of her reputation as a skilled seamstress. She sat at her work table, the same table where she had spent countless hours listening to wealthy women's secrets, and she allowed herself, for the first time in 8 months, to stop planning, to stop calculating, to simply exist. Samuel visited her that evening. They sat together in her small room, not speaking for a long time. Finally, Samuel broke the silence. "It's done, isn't it?" he said. "Everything you planned, it's finished." Mary nodded. "All 8 of them, gone. Do you feel better? Does it help with the pain of losing Grace?" Mary considered the question carefully. "No, nothing brings her back. Nothing changes what happened. But I kept my promise to myself. I made them pay. I proved that we're not powerless, that we're not the simple, stupid property they think we are, that we can fight back, even when the law offers us no protection. What happens now? Now we survive. We continue. We wait for freedom to come, however long that takes." But even as Mary spoke these words, she knew that survival wouldn't be simple. Because there was one person who suspected the truth. One person whose intelligence matched Mary's own, who had observed the pattern of deaths and scandals, and had begun to piece together the possibility that they weren't random. Mrs. Eleanor Thornton, the formidable woman who had lost her husband and son, who had seen her family destroyed, who had been at the center of Henrico County's social world, and now found herself cast out from it. Eleanor Thornton was many things: cruel, proud, convinced of her own superiority. But she was not stupid. And in the long, lonely months after her family's destruction, she had thought about the pattern of events, about who had been present for key moments, about who had access to information, about who could have orchestrated such a complex series of revelations. On a cold December morning, Eleanor Thornton came to the sewing room where Mary worked. She dismissed the other servants and closed the door. Then she turned to Mary, her face a mask of controlled fury. "It was you, wasn't it?" Eleanor said, her voice low and dangerous. "All of it. My husband, my son, the others. You orchestrated everything." Mary kept her face neutral, her hand steady on the fabric she was sewing. "I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Thornton. I'm just a seamstress." "Don't play simple with me. I've watched you for years. I've seen how you listen, how you remember, how your eyes miss nothing. You're the smartest person in any room, and you've spent your entire life pretending to be stupid to survive." Mary said nothing. What could she say? Denial would be pointless. Eleanor had already decided. "My husband sold your daughter," Eleanor continued. "That's what started this, isn't it? You decided to punish everyone involved, and you succeeded. You destroyed 8 men using nothing but their own secrets and their own weaknesses. It's almost admirable, in a horrifying sort of way." "If I were capable of such a thing," Mary said carefully. "Which I'm not, because I'm just property without the intelligence or ability to plan something so complex. Would you blame someone for seeking justice when the law offered none?" "Justice?" Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "You call this justice? My husband is dead. My son is dead. My family is destroyed. What did I do to deserve that?" "You stood by," Mary said, dropping her pretense of simplicity for just a moment. "You watched a 4-year-old child sold away from her mother. You saw it happen. You could have said something, could have convinced your husband to reconsider, could have shown one moment of mercy or compassion. But you didn't. You looked away. You went back to your tea party. You forgot about it within an hour. Just another business transaction. Just another piece of property changing hands. Eleanor stared at her, and for a moment, something like recognition flickered in her eyes. Not sympathy, not regret, but recognition that Mary was human, that she felt pain, that she loved her child just as Eleanor had loved hers. "What will you do now?" Mary asked. "Will you tell the authorities, accuse me, try to have me punished?" Eleanor considered this for a long moment. Who would believe me? An enslaved woman orchestrating the destruction of 8 prominent white men. It's impossible, unthinkable. Even if I had proof, which I don't, no one would accept it. It would make me look insane, claiming that a slave outsmarted everyone. She moved toward the door, then paused. "I won't say anything, not because I forgive you, not because I think what you did was right, but because proving it would require admitting that you're smarter than every white man in this county, and that admission would destroy the last shred of dignity I have left." Eleanor left without another word. Mary never saw her again. Eleanor Thornton moved to Charleston to live with distant relatives, leaving Virginia and its painful memories behind. Mary remained at Riverside Plantation working for the new owner, maintaining her role as the skilled, quiet seamstress. But word of her abilities spread. Other plantation owners requested her services. She became one of the most sought-after seamstresses in Central Virginia, earning small amounts of money that she saved carefully. Samuel continued working as a blacksmith. They saw each other when they could, 2 people bound by shared loss and shared secrets, building what happiness they could in the margins of their lives. The years passed. The tensions that had been building between North and South over slavery continued to escalate. The Compromise of 1850 tried to hold the nation together but only delayed the inevitable. Arguments over Kansas and Nebraska territory turned violent. The Dred Scott decision in 1857 declared that black people had no rights that white people were bound to respect. Mary watched these developments with careful attention. She understood that something fundamental was shifting, that the system of slavery was becoming unsustainable, that the contradictions at the heart of American society were reaching a breaking point. In 1859, John Brown led his raid on Harper's Ferry, attempting to start a slave rebellion. The raid failed, and Brown was executed, but his actions terrified the South and energized abolitionists in the North. The country moved closer to open conflict. On a spring evening in 1860, Mary sat in her room and allowed herself to think about Grace. Her daughter would be 13 now if she was still alive. Mary had no way of knowing where Grace had been taken, whether she was healthy, whether she even remembered her mother. The pain of that loss had not diminished with time. It remained a constant ache, a wound that would never fully heal. But Mary had transformed that pain into something powerful. She had proven that the enslaved were not powerless, that intelligence and patience could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, that justice could come even when the law denied it. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December. Other southern states followed. By April 1861, the nation was at war. The Civil War transformed everything. As Union armies advanced into Virginia, enslaved people began running away to Union lines, claiming their freedom. The institution of slavery, which had seemed permanent and unshakable, began to crumble. Mary was 40 years old when the war began. She had lived her entire life in bondage, but she had never allowed that bondage to touch her spirit, her intelligence, her sense of self-worth. She had demonstrated, in the most dramatic way possible, that enslaved people were complete human beings, capable of complex thought and strategic action. In the spring of 1862, Union forces occupied parts of Henrico County. Riverside Plantation's owner fled, abandoning the property. The enslaved people who remained were suddenly unexpectedly free. Mary walked away from the plantation on an April morning. She took nothing but the clothes she wore and the money she had saved over the years. She went to Richmond, where thousands of formerly enslaved people were gathering, creating new communities, building new lives. She found work as a seamstress, using her skills to support herself in freedom. She rented a small room in a boarding house. She began, for the first time in her life, to make decisions about her own existence without needing permission from a white owner. And she searched for grace. She went to every refugee camp, every gathering of formerly enslaved people, asking if anyone knew of a girl who would now be 16, who had been sold south from Virginia in 1851. She described her daughter's face, her voice, her mannerisms, hoping against hope that someone might have seen her, might know where she was. The search was probably futile. Hundreds of thousands of people had been sold south over the decades. Grace could be anywhere, from Louisiana to Texas to Arkansas. She might not even be alive. The mortality rate among enslaved people on the cotton plantations of the Deep South was horrific. But Mary had to try, had to hope, had to believe that somehow, against all odds, she might find her daughter again. She never did. Despite years of searching, despite asking every person she met, despite writing letters to organizations that helped reunite families torn apart by slavery, Mary never found Grace. This was the reality for thousands of families. The domestic trade in enslaved people had destroyed family connections so thoroughly that reconstruction was often impossible. Children sold away didn't know their parents' names. Parents didn't know where their children had been taken. Records, when they existed at all, were incomplete or deliberately obscured. Mary eventually accepted that she would never see Grace again in this life. The acceptance was agonizing but necessary. She couldn't spend the rest of her life searching for someone who might not even be alive. She had to move forward, had to build a life in freedom, had to honor her daughter's memory by surviving and thriving. Samuel found her in Richmond in 1863. He had been working with Union forces as a blacksmith, shoeing horses and repairing equipment. They reunited and, for the first time in their lives, were married legally. Their union recognized by law rather than just by their own commitment to each other. They built a life together in freedom. It wasn't easy. The war continued for 2 more years. The South was devastated. Even after the war ended, formerly enslaved people faced violence, discrimination, and systematic oppression through black codes and eventually Jim Crow laws. But Mary and Samuel were free. They owned their own labor. They made their own choices. They built a small home in Richmond. They participated in the political reconstruction of Virginia, fighting for black rights and representation. Mary never spoke publicly about what she had done in 1851. How could she? Admitting to orchestrating 8 men's deaths, even in the cause of justice, even in response to unbearable provocation, would have been dangerous. The legal system was still controlled by white people who would not look kindly on a black woman who had destroyed white men, regardless of the circumstances. So she kept her secrets. Only Samuel knew the full truth, and he never betrayed her confidence. But Mary did speak about slavery, about the horrors she had witnessed, about families torn apart, about the systematic dehumanization of an entire people. She spoke to Northern journalists who came south to document the war's aftermath. She spoke to church groups and aid societies. She told her story, not the story of revenge, but the story of survival, of maintaining humanity in the face of oppression. Her testimony, along with thousands of others, helped shape Northern understanding of what slavery had actually been. Not the romanticized version presented in Southern mythology, but the brutal reality of human beings treated as property, of families destroyed, of violence used as a tool of control. Mary lived for another 34 years after the war ended. She and Samuel never had more children. The trauma of losing Grace had been too deep, but they built a rich life nonetheless. They were active in Richmond's black community, helping newly freed people learn to read, advocating for education and economic opportunity. Mary continued working as a seamstress until age 70, her skills still remarkable, her attention to detail still perfect. She trained several young women in the craft, passing on her knowledge to a new generation who would use their skills in freedom rather than bondage. She died in 1899 at age 77, surrounded by friends and community members who knew her as a respected elder, a wise woman, a survivor of the worst America had to offer, who had nevertheless built a meaningful life. At her funeral, Samuel spoke briefly. He was 81, frail, but still sharp-minded. He told the assembled community about Mary's strength, her intelligence, her unwavering commitment to justice and dignity. And then quietly, so that only those closest to him could hear, he added, "She never forgot our daughter Grace. She never stopped fighting for justice. She proved that we were never the simple, powerless people they claimed we were. She was brilliant. She was strategic. She was the smartest person I ever knew. And she made them pay for what they did to her, to us, to all of us." Those who heard understood, at least partially. They knew Mary had resisted in some way. They didn't need to know the details. The important thing was that she had fought back, had refused to accept oppression passively, had insisted on her humanity even when the law denied it. Mary's story, like thousands of others, faded from popular memory. The official histories didn't record it. The textbooks didn't mention it. She became one more unnamed black woman who survived slavery and lived into freedom, her specific actions and achievements lost to time. But her legacy persisted, not in written records, but in the oral traditions of black communities, in the stories passed down through generations about ancestors who resisted, who fought back, who refused to be broken by bondage, in the understanding that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents of their own destinies, using whatever tools they had available to claim dignity and justice. The 8 men Mary destroyed were not innocent victims. They were active participants in a system of oppression that destroyed millions of lives. They profited from stolen labor. They participated in the destruction of families. They treated human beings as property to be bought and sold. When that system offered Mary no recourse, no legal avenue for justice, no protection for her family, she created her own justice. She used the only weapons available to her: intelligence, patience, and intimate knowledge of her oppressors' weaknesses. Was it moral? That question has no simple answer. We cannot judge people living under systematic oppression by the same standards we apply to those living in relative freedom and safety. We didn't experience what Mary experienced. We didn't watch our children sold away. We didn't live under constant threat of violence with no legal protection. What we can say is this: Mary's actions were a response to an immoral system. They were the natural result of pushing human beings beyond endurance. They were proof that the enslaved were not the simple, stupid beings white supremacy claimed them to be, but intelligent, strategic people capable of complex planning and execution. Her story matters because it complicates our understanding of slavery. It moves beyond the simple narrative of helpless victims waiting for white saviors. It shows enslaved people as active resistors, as people who fought back constantly in ways both large and small. Some resistance was open rebellion, like Nat Turner's uprising. Some was running away to freedom via the Underground Railroad. Some was daily sabotage, slowing work, breaking tools, preserving cultural traditions in defiance of attempts to strip away African heritage. And some, like Mary's, was psychological warfare, using intelligence to identify weaknesses, patient planning to create opportunities, strategic action to destroy oppressors without leaving evidence that could be traced back to the resistor. These forms of resistance all mattered. They all demonstrated that enslaved people refused to accept their dehumanization. They all proved that the spirit cannot be chained, even when the body is. The impact of Mary's actions rippled outward in ways she never knew. The destruction of 8 prominent families weakened elite society in Henrico County. It created space for new social arrangements. It demonstrated that the powerful were vulnerable. Did this inspire others? Possibly. The historical record shows an increase in accidents befalling slave owners in Virginia in the years following 1851. Wells collapsed, buildings burned, equipment failed at critical moments, horses threw their riders in fatal falls. Were all of these genuine accidents, or were some carefully orchestrated acts of resistance inspired by stories like Mary's that circulated through the slave community? We'll never know for certain, but the pattern suggests that enslaved people were paying attention, learning, adapting their resistance strategies. The Civil War finally brought legal freedom to 4 million enslaved people, but that freedom came at enormous cost. 600,000 Americans died in the conflict. The South was devastated, and even after the war, true equality remained elusive. Reconstruction briefly promised full citizenship and rights, but was betrayed by the Compromise of 1877 and the rise of Jim Crow. The struggle that began with people like Mary continued for another century. Through the Civil Rights Movement, through ongoing fights against systematic racism in criminal justice, education, housing, employment. The legacy of slavery persists in America today, more than 150 years after its formal abolition. We tell stories like Mary's not to glorify violence or revenge, but to preserve truth, to honor the people who survived impossible circumstances, to recognize that resistance has always been necessary in the face of oppression, to understand that when legal systems fail to provide justice, people will seek it through other means. Mary's story teaches us several critical lessons. First, that intelligence and strategic thinking exist independent of social status or formal education. Mary had no schooling, but her mind was brilliant, capable of orchestrating complex plans that outmaneuvered educated white men. Second, that patience is a powerful weapon. Mary didn't act impulsively. She waited. She planned. She struck when the moment was right, and in ways that protected her from discovery. Third, that knowing your opponent is crucial. Mary understood the psychology of elite Southern white men better than they understood themselves. She recognized their fears, their weaknesses, their priorities. She used that knowledge as her primary weapon. Fourth, that systems built on injustice contain the seeds of their own destruction. Mary didn't create the secrets, the scandals, the weaknesses that destroyed her targets. Those already existed. She simply revealed them, accelerated their consequences, and connected them in ways that created cascading effects. And finally, that human beings will always fight back against oppression. The form of that resistance may vary. The methods may differ. But the fundamental refusal to accept dehumanization, the insistence on dignity and justice, these are universal human characteristics that no amount of oppression can eliminate. Say their names, remember their stories, honor their resistance: Mary, Grace, Samuel, Eleanor, the 8 men who died, the thousands of unnamed people who survived slavery and fought back in ways large and small. This is American history, the complicated, painful, truthful version that makes us uncomfortable, but that we must face honestly, the version that acknowledges the depths of the injustice while also celebrating the resilience and resistance of those who survived it. Never forget what happened. Never minimize the horror. Never pretend it was less brutal than it was. But also never forget that enslaved people were not passive victims. They were fighters, resistors, survivors, who refused to let bondage define them completely. Mary lived 77 years, 40 in slavery, 37 in freedom. She lost her daughter. She destroyed 8 men. She survived the Civil War. She built a life in freedom. She passed on her knowledge and her story to those who came after. Her legacy lives in every person who refuses to accept injustice, in every person who fights back when systems fail to provide protection, in every person who insists on their dignity and humanity regardless of what society tells them. The struggle continues. The fight for true equality, for justice, for recognition of full humanity goes on. We stand on the shoulders of people like Mary, people who paid enormous costs, people who sacrificed everything, people who refused to be broken. Their story is our story. Their fight is our fight. Their resilience is our inheritance. Never forget. Never forgive the system that created such suffering. And never stop fighting for a world where such desperate measures are no longer necessary because justice is available to everyone through legitimate means. This is the truth. This is the history. This is what happened when America built an empire on stolen bodies and broken families. And this is how people fought back, claimed their humanity, and insisted on justice when the law offered none. Remember Mary. Remember Grace. Remember all of them. Their suffering matters. Their resistance matters. Their stories deserve to be told, preserved, and honored.